quick question. Who in here has participated in the multi-tenancy working group already? Awesome. A lot of new people, that's perfect. This is an intro overview. We will have a deep dive overview tomorrow, and so that is something I would super recommend if anything that we talk of here is of interest for maybe a live demo, I don't know, but yeah, cool. So how many people here have participated in the upstream Kubernetes community before? Okay. So, so just to give a quick overview, so this is the multi-tenancy working group for Kubernetes, and so some of the questions that we seek to identify as a working group is why do people want multi-tenancy? What do they want out of a multi-tenant control plane, data plane? What do they think of as a tenant? In a lot of cases, we see clusters that are being shared internally between a bunch of different teams, maybe a bunch of different organizations, but then we also talk to people who are maybe running Kubernetes control plane as a multi-tenant service that they're selling to end users, and they need significantly different controls at that point, depending on what level of access they're going to give to the API control plane. So as a working group, we have done pretty extensive definitions on all of these terms before, and so we have a ton of documentation if people want to check it out, but these are really what we're looking at. So what do people want out of multi-tenancy? When people say that they want multi-tenancy, what do they mean? What do they think a tenant is? What are their different use cases? We have a really great use case doc that a bunch of different SIGs have found very valuable to them because they can just kind of look and see all of the various use cases that people are trying to solve for. So if you have a use case that you would like to bring to the working group, we would love to have that. And that would be a very easy way to get started contributing and kind of sharing what you're looking for out of multi-tenancy. And then finally, we're looking at different models of tenancy. And I didn't go into this in this deck because we've gone over it a bunch of other times, but we have sort of two models of tenancy that we talk a lot about within the tenancy group, and there's what we call hard multi-tenancy, and there's what we call soft multi-tenancy. Soft multi-tenancy, the way to sort of think of it is it's tenancy that we are seeking to achieve in an environment of some level of trust. So for example, perhaps I have a shared Kubernetes control plane and everyone who has access to it is an employee of this company and has some sort of vested interest in not aggressively hacking or doing denial of service attacks on their coworkers because they would get fired. So that's sort of like what we think of as soft multi-tenancy. And then we also talk a lot about hard multi-tenancy, and hard multi-tenancy is no trust. You need complete lockdown. You probably need separate API control planes for separate tenants, and you need complete storage isolation, network isolation, and so those are sort of the 2 degrees of tenancy that we talk a lot about. So that's kind of what we do. We have a lot of docs you can check out. If you're interested in participating in the working group, you can find us on the Kubernetes Slack. So Kubernetes has its own open source Slack, which is distinct from the CNCF Slack. You can join at this really easy to remember URL, so just slack.kates.io. And then we have our own channel. A bunch of people in the channel talk about multi-tenancy, ask questions, post links to what they're working on. It's really pretty chatty. Not super chatty if you're not into that, but the right level of chat. And so we also have a Google group. So for people who haven't participated in the Kubernetes upstream community before, we're very Google group oriented. We do all have GitHubs where the code lives, but if you join the Google group, and you can just go to groups.google.com and you can search for whatever working group SIG you're interested in, and you will see the Google group, and you can join it very easily. You can click join, and then you'll start getting the mailing list, but you'll also get all the calendar invitations. So if you're like, I know you people are meeting without me, why? Like, how come you never invite me to anything? Join the Google group. You will be invited to literally everything. So right now in our group, we have a bi-weekly meeting. It's Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. We do record all of our meetings. They're all on YouTube. We have a playlist. And we have a GitHub repo for all of the code for the proof of concepts and incubator projects that we're working on that we're going to go over as part of this presentation. Yeah, and if there's any questions about how to get started or how to get involved, when you go to our GitHub link that's at the bottom of this doc, we have a links.md that has links to literally everything. So if you're ever like, oh, I heard you once did this thing, the link is in that page. So who are we and why are we doing this? So there's me, I'm Tasha. All of these ats are our Slack handles. So I'm a product line manager at VMware. I work on Project Pacific, if people have heard of Project Pacific. I also work on Tanzu for SDDC and Kubernetes stuff, specifically on vSphere. My co-chair is Sanjeev Rampal. He is a principal engineer at Cisco, and he will be doing a deep dive on all of these projects tomorrow. We also have our project leads, and we're lucky enough to have two of them in the room with us today, and I might ask them to go over their projects since obviously they can do that in a pretty awesome way, and I may have stolen their slides to make this deck, so it's rude to present other people's slides in front of them, right? But we have Adrian Ludwin. He's working on the Hierarchical Namespace Controller. We call that HNC, and everyone always hears agency and then thinks that we have this really sweet agency project. So it's just HNC, and I don't know, maybe we'll call it agency as an inside joke. So we're going to go over that a little bit. Adrian's going to get up and talk through that. We also have Fei Guo here. He's been working on a project we call the Virtual Clusters Project, which has been open sourced out of Alibaba, based on how they provide multi-tenancy to their different groups at Alibaba. And he's also been working on our Tenant Controller, which is a way to run a controller in your control plane and provide tenants construct. He's a software engineer at Alibaba. And finally, I don't think Jim made it, but we have Jim Bagwadia, and he's been working on multi-tenancy benchmarks, which I'll go over in a little bit of depth. But that is a very cool project that identifies one of the things we at the multi-tenancy group realized was a problem we needed to tackle, which is how can we define secure multi-tenancy if we haven't defined what secure means as a community. And so these benchmarks really allow us to start to formalize when you spin up a Kubernetes cluster, you can run these benchmarks against it to see is it following these different best practices, NIST-based security procedures. So, and he is the founder and CEO at Nirmata. So cool. Adrian, I will pass it over to you.
Hi, my name's Adrian. Work at Google in Waterloo, Canada. Any Canadians here? Say sorry? Yeah, okay, good. So yeah, we're working on the Hierarchical Namespace Controller, and I think almost anybody who's ever looked at namespaces has said, why do I only get a flat list? Why can I not put them inside of another one? But it's always been considered to be very difficult to try to put that into Kubernetes itself. Rightly so, the bar for getting anything into core Kubernetes is extremely high right now. And so what we decided to try out as decided to try out this usage model as a controller that's external and you can just install. And so what you can do is you can set up a couple of namespaces that represent different aspects of your organization, such as your organization, your team, and maybe some services underneath that team, because you want to isolate the services from one another, even though you're going to have common policies, common management across them. And so in this example here, what you can see is that I've put some policies, some RBAC policies for my site reliability engineers into my org, and maybe some network policies. And at the org level, and then at the team level, I've got some RBAC policies for the team members, and maybe a different network policy for the services in that team as well. And what you want is you want them to cascade down, sort of like inheritance in C++ or Java. So what the HNC does is it lets you define this singleton custom resource called the hierarchy config, and you put it in the team namespace and you point it at the org namespace, and those policy objects get magically copied down, and then you can do the same thing. And so even though you haven't actually defined any policy objects in your service namespaces, they all get propagated in. And of course, if you change the hierarchy, the new objects will get, the old objects will be deleted, the new ones will be copied in. If you modify the objects themselves, they get propagated as well. We will also do a bunch of checks to make sure you don't do anything silly, like make yourself your own parent, and you can integrate into existing Kubernetes policy objects because we add labels onto the namespaces. So for example, you can use a label selector to say, allow ingress from all namespaces that are labeled with team A, or team 1 in this case. I'll just skip by this very quickly, but basically the way it works is that we keep an in-memory view of what the hierarchy is, and we have one controller that reconciles the hierarchy itself, another controller that reconciles all of the objects, and then we also have a bunch of admission webhooks to make sure that you don't shoot yourself in the foot. Please come and talk to me if you are interested in using this. The number one thing we need right now is for people to use this and see if it meets their use cases. I'm not sure if it was actually on the slide, but the one last thing that it can do for you is that if you want to create sub-namespaces and you don't have cluster-level namespace creation privileges, it can allow you to do that as well. So you can create sub-namespaces under something that you already have admin access to. That's the HNC. Thanks, everyone.
Cool, and now Faye's going to go over the virtual cluster work he's been doing at Alibaba.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not very prepared, but I don't try to take too much time. So I probably won't go through too much details about this project, but I can share some high-level idea why do you want to have this, because given that currently Kubernetes has namespace to do certain level of isolation, the main problem that we face is that even like Tasha mentioned, within an organization, it is a trustworthy environment. Sometimes your Kubernetes API server can be denial of service attacks by some people unintentionally, probably just because they just implement a very stupid controller. So, because the current the Kubernetes core Kubernetes is not designed. When we designed it, it's not designed for multi-tenancy. So there is a lot of missing part to do a very strict isolation from the control plane perspective. So in Alibaba, we want to start this kind of project like using the virtual cluster to do very strong isolation on the control plane is actually try to save our SRE members' life. So because we see some cases there is really, you can hit a case that it is very difficult to recover for a failure state if you don't very strong isolation. So our idea here is, I think I can skip this. So basically our basic idea is we, in our multi-tenancy model is we will give each tenant user a very dedicated API server. So they will share the resource from the same resource provider, which we call Supermaster, which is the Kubernetes cluster which provide actually pod resource. The kind of core idea is we have a bunch of the CRDs like controllers do kind of resource syncing. Basically, each tenant user operates its own dedicated control plane. There is a syncer kind of controller keep copying the pod objects from the tenant master to the supermaster, and the supermaster use a unified scheduler to do the provisioning. So this is the overall idea of having dedicated API server for the tenant user to achieve kind of much, I would say much better isolation compared with the pure namespace-based isolation model. So. Okay, another part of the work which is not directly related to the Alibaba's proposal is in general the effort that our entire multi-tenancy working group trying to solve is trying to define a kind of tenant model for people to easily config, solve. I think when I joined the working group, there was a problem is what is the right way for a tenant admin to create a namespace, which is a very critical class scope resource. So what is the best way to assign RBAC permissions for tenant admin to create roles namespace? So that we have a long debate of how to actually do that, and we come up with a design. We have a POC. I think it's tenant. I don't know if you described before. It's tenant controller version 1.
Right.
So then we come up with a new design, which is we call version 2. And I'm pretty much in charge of implement the version 2 tenant controller design. Try to solve the problem is how to do the namespace self-service namespace creation for the tenant admins. That's and to make sure the controller works, solve all the corner cases,
Yeah.
solve some bugs. And we also have some plans integrated with HNC for the even sophisticated RBAC setting population for multiple namespaces. So that's our kind of future plan of doing the combined multiple projects.
Yeah.
But I think the details will be covered more in tomorrow's
In the deep
sessions.
dive, yeah, cool, thanks. Oh, you can keep it. Cool. So those are 3 of the projects. The other thing that we want to do with the architecture of these projects is to keep them very separate. So if you need the capabilities of the hierarchical namespace controller, but you don't like what the tenant controller is doing, you can just use that on its own. But then we also want to do proof of concept showing you how you would use these tools together to get a better tenant and hierarchical namespace controller experience. And then same with virtual clusters, which I think is going to be using the tenancy controller as well. Again, all of the design docs are online. All of these slides are in PDF form. If you go to the session information for this session, so you can click on the links, you can check this all out. And the code is all in our Kubernetes SIG repo under incubating, I think, incubator. So check that all out. The other cool thing that we have going on right now, which I mentioned at the beginning, is our multi-tenancy benchmarks. And I don't think Jim is here, but he and his team have been doing a ton of work, which you can check out in the design doc. And the initial sort of push towards these benchmarks is now also in our GitHub repo. So what he has done with his team is create these different levels of multi-tenancy profile. So you can stand up your cluster and then run the benchmarks against your cluster and then see what configurations you may be missing in that cluster. And so the idea with this is let's start to really have some good benchmarking around having a secure profile for your cluster and being able to see how it's configured as it's running, and then perhaps in the future make sure that it stays configured in that secure way. And this becomes really important for us as the multi-tenancy working group because we can make a lot of tools and a lot of recommendations about how you can have a secure multi-tenant cluster, but first we really have to, as a community, agree on what that means and what sort of the knobs and dials and tubes are that you're going to use to configure that secure cluster to begin with. So these benchmarks are in active development. We're making a lot of very fast progress on this, and then this becomes a tool suite that we can use potentially with something like conformance. So today, when you are running all your conformance checks against upstream Kubernetes, if you've locked down your cluster, you fail conformance because it is just checking to make sure that this is like pure upstream Kubernetes and it's not locked down yet. So what we would like to do in the future, as we all agree as a community that these benchmarks evolve towards something that we all agree on for a secure benchmarking, we could perhaps have a secure conformance check. And so you could say this is the secure conformant upstream Kubernetes versus the pure upstream that hasn't been configured yet. And so that's something that we're working with the community to sort of move forward with this project. The other thing that we're going to do with this is we're going to submit our benchmarks to the Kubernetes bug bounty. We have a bunch of security researchers who are paid to hack on Kubernetes and see what is and isn't working and how they can exploit it. So once we have these secure benchmarks, we will submit that to the bug bounty. It will actually help them a lot because they've been asking for profiles of different cluster types so that they can really try and exploit them. And then we'll get that feedback and make the benchmarks themselves that much better. So those are the 4 major projects that we have been working on. At KubeCon this week, this evening, we are going to have a panel. We tried to phrase it in a way that sounds like it's going to involve a lot of debate, control plane versus data plane, untangling the tenets of multi-tenancy. So we'll see if we get any good feisty debate over the different aspects of multi-tenancy. So that's this evening at 4:25 if anyone would like to check it out. Tomorrow, Sanjeev and Adrian and other guest stars will be presenting a deep dive that I hear is going to include some demos of the various projects and kind of as much depth as we can possibly get into in the half hour plus that we're provided. So definitely if this all seems interesting to you, you want to see more, you want to see it running, check that out. And Faye has also recorded a demo of Virtual Cluster that we have on YouTube right now if you'd like to see that running and kind of get a feel for that. And I will be adding that to our YouTube channel since I just reminded myself. Yeah. Cool. So that's sort of the overview of what we're up to as a multi-tenancy working group. The best ways to get involved, join our mailing list on Google Groups, check out our code on Kubernetes-SIG, and now we're all here and happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah. Oh, I have a microphone too, but yes, I'll just repeat your question.
Are there any reference implementations you're looking at as a starting point, or as any companies or products that you're using as a starting place?
Yeah, so it depends on the different projects and sort of like the evolution of the different projects. So for example, some of Hierarchical Namespace is based on what Google Anthos is doing with their Git delivery sort of workflow and how you spin up child namespaces and having this hierarchical structure where you're copying down policy, so that is very much inherited from what Anthos is doing. The tenant CRD has gone through sort of two evolutions. So the first evolution was proposed and we built it out, and I think that was probably based maybe a little bit on GKE. And then we really realized that the architectural direction we were going in wasn't going to work. So we kind of learned a lot from that, and now I would say it's just a new evolution of how we think we can achieve what people are trying to do with tenancy. Virtual clusters obviously is from what Alibaba is using in production today. And then the the benchmarking project is based a lot on what the Nirmata team I think has seen as they provide enterprise Kubernetes to various customers. So each one really has sort of its foundation and what people are doing for their customers in various projects, internal or external. And then it kind of evolves in perhaps a different direction because it's not custom built for that solution. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One question regarding the benchmarks. Great idea, by the way. Maybe I didn't get it. Do you have a mapping of the three approaches or the three designs that you're looking at to those levels of architecture, or has that kind of developed on a different track based on
So the question is there a mapping of what the different levels mean, and are they different approaches of multi-tenancy? Is that the question?
Yeah, well, you have the hierarchical namespace.
Oh, yeah.
Do they
Map.
right now map naturally to those levels?
No, so the tools that we're evolving are not mapped to the benchmarks. So it's like we're providing tools, various tools are being evolved to sort of take on different aspects of what people are trying to do to share clusters between teams, and that's kind of the genesis of each of the open source projects. And then the benchmarks themselves are more focused on NIST and other security benchmarks. Yeah. Cool. Question? Sorry. Yeah.
The hierarchical namespace controller, how does that propagate resource quotas across all of the children namespaces? So as a parent namespace with a resource quota, how do you make sure that there's some namespaces aren't overloading their resource quota?
This needs to go into the FAQ. So right now we haven't implemented a hierarchical resource quota yet. What we do have is if you set a resource quota, let's say at the org level, will be propagated into all of the Leaf namespaces, and so we'll impose something there. Now, if you can also create your own unlimited child namespaces, you may spy a problem with this approach, which is that every child namespace you create will get the same quota. And so yes, we've had a lot of people asking us about building a hierarchical resource quota, which of course you can build as an external webhook, which I have not yet looked at doing. It might not go into this it might be a slightly separate project. It could certainly be based off of the hierarchy. We need to look at that, but it's certainly something that lots of people ask about as soon as they hear about this project.
Yes. I mean, I'll take a project-specific question. So the question is, are any of these projects mapping to what we're doing in Project Pacific, which is a vSphere project that I work on? So right now, I joined the multi-tenancy working group because obviously Project Pacific is a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster, and we wanted to see if we could work with the community to upstream a lot of what we're doing to really lock down the infrastructure layer of Project Pacific over the SXI clusters. But when I joined, I realized that people weren't quite ready for that, and so we were going to kind of start off with the problems in front of us and then start bringing kind of more proposals. So initially what I wanted to do is actually really reflected in the benchmarking piece, because what I wanted to do was suggest that we have secure profiles for clusters, and then that we have secure conformant clusters. And so that work, I think, is going to align really nicely. And then as far as the hierarchical namespace and the tenancy controller, I think those are probably be tools that we'll look at incorporating into what we're doing. And for a virtual cluster, that architecture is very similar to what we're doing in some ways. So it's, yeah, all over the place. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, to repeat the question, how do we make sure that you provision the same namespaces in all of the different clusters? The answer is that is, to a certain extent, out of scope. We do talk a lot about multiple clusters, but they do have their own separate SIG. So we don't want to step on their toes, although we talk to them as well. When we talk about multi-tenancy, we are really talking about in-cluster multi-tenancy, because if you want to have, cluster per tenant, that's a very different, you're going to use a different set of tools. Now, we are designing this so that it can be used with any kind of GitOps flow. So you could use it with Flux or any other number of, or ACM, I should mention, any of these tools that can sync manifests to a variety of different clusters, make sure that they're all upgraded in a sane fashion. But that's not built into this. This is in cluster only.
Any other questions? Cool. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, super active Slack channel. Jump in, ask questions, check out our links, provide your use cases. We would love to hear them. And yeah, if there are pieces of multi-tenancy that you're interested in that you see us not addressing, we'd like to start to address those as well. So yeah, would love to work more with you. Also, I have multi-tenancy buttons if anyone needs a button. Notice a lot of people are tragically under-buttoned here, so yeah, let me know.